some of the discussions over the coffee break were really about the level of regulatory governance in relation to this area. And I'm not going to ease that picture, I'm afraid. I'll be talking about a further level of regulatory guidance that needs to be considered in addition to the EU AI Act and the UK regulatory framework in relation to AI. I mean, we've had a lot of discussion about the context, in terms of medtech. This is just some more, really. It is an exciting area, growth area for medtech and AI, and money being put into this space, which is great to see. Part of that, and when we're talking about this, and we're talking about data, the dataverse, what is the data that is involved and how it is regulated is really what Tom and I are going to be speaking about. And to put this into some further context, earlier on we had this brilliant insight into the imaging, medical imaging world, and that gave us really a feel for the kinds of different players that have to be involved and the huge volume of data that has to be involved to develop and use these types of devices. We see it in a variety of different types of devices and applications. So, I was thinking, okay, well, we've got, what kind of data are we talking about? We're talking about the data that you can gather and receive in terms of implantable devices like pacemakers. We talked about wearables and the data that they collect, patterns of physical activity, sleep, blood sugar levels, etc. Imaging, of course. Smart surgical instruments, this is another area, where information can be gathered from that device, how it is used, how long for, and in what context. And sometimes it'll be connected with specific individual profiles, but sometimes it's pure data relating to the operation of a device, and that is relevant in terms of data governance. And of course, remote diagnostics and a variety of things, really. Data can be captured in relation to geolocation, timestamps, etc. So huge amounts of data. And in terms of understanding the regulatory picture, data could be personal data. In relation to medical devices, it could be data that is being used in a way that can identify the person to whom that information relates, or it could be non-personal data. And we are used to operating in an environment where personal data is highly regulated. We're now moving to stage 2 of non-personal data also being regulated. This is part of the EU digital strategy. Whoop, whoop. And the EU digital strategy, the EU AI Act is part of that. We'll be talking about the EU Data Act, and there are different levels to the EU overall digital strategy aimed at creating a really robust framework to enable these kinds of innovations to succeed and thrive, and to make data more accessible to people and protected. So that's the overall concept. How it translates into industry, though, can be complex and require a lot of regulatory levels of input. Again, when we're using this data, it can be in a variety of ways. Again, when we're looking at how data is regulated, we have to keep these sorts of things in context. So what is the data? Is it personal? Is it non-personal? What are we using it for? And so that's really always the basics when you're thinking about your, looking at how the regulation applies. Just really understanding what you're doing, what kind of information you're collecting and what you're doing with it. Sounds basic, but it can be quite difficult because of multiple players and different data flows that can be involved in this sector. With this context in mind, Tom and I are going to look at different regulatory aspects. And one of the things that's particularly new is the EU Data Act, and that's where we will spend a little bit of time focusing. There is some new development into the UK data environment, and we will touch on that briefly. I think in this area, we often have the question of data that could start by being personal data, or which is clearly personal data in the hands of one party. At what point can we just regard it as data and not regulated personal data? And there's been some developments in this area that we can share. And we thought we would just touch on cybersecurity just because we are operating in such an environment of vulnerability to hackers and cyber attacks, and the more data that we use in connected devices, this is becoming an increasingly important area to look at. So with that background, I'm going to hand over to Tom.
Thank you. What I'm going to talk about for the next 5 to 10 minutes or so is the EU Data Act, which, as Joe mentioned a minute ago, it's obviously another regulatory layer when you're talking about data. But to pick up, I think it was the answer to this gentleman's question earlier, is that hopefully what we can see is that although there are, it does expand it, there are a lot of obligations covered by it. The principles and the sort of types of things that you'll need to do to comply with them should be familiar from compliance with GDPR, some EU AI Act principles as well. So it shouldn't be a whole change of mindset required, just a development of what is already there. So the first question to answer is, before we get into the detail of what's actually covered, is why is the EU Data Act relevant? Why are we talking about it? Brexit means Brexit, and we're not there anymore. As with, say, the GDPR, the EU Data Act has extraterritorial effect. So, in essence, if you are not based in the EU, but you are supplying, say, in this context, medical devices to users within the EU, if you are a data holder transferring data to recipients in the EU, or you're a recipient in the EU receiving data, which we'll come on to in a minute, the EU Data Act is going to apply to that. So that's really why we need to be sort of aware of it. And I've also, again, I don't have Tom's nifty graphic from earlier, but a similar timeline in terms of its implementation. And other than sort of spoiling some of the points that I'm going to make in a minute, the main reason for putting this up here is that we can see it's already in force, and we're between the 12th of September 2025 and the 12th of September 2026. So some of the provisions are already in force, probably the ones that are less likely to apply immediately, and others are still to go. And the other thing that's not on this slide, but the other reason why do we need to take notice of EU legislation would be to discuss the penalties for non-compliance. And what the EU Data Act really has said is that it's up for the member states to come up with their own penalties for non-compliance, as long as they are sort of proportionate, deterrent, and have a deterrent effect. So it's going to be a sort of, the penalty is going to depend upon the member state that's enforcing it. That's another thing to be aware of. So what's covered by the EU Data Act? And I think the thing to say here, and it's the same with the EU AI Act as well, is that both of them are obviously sort of sector agnostic. So they're just providing sort of high-level principles and obligations, but not with any focus on a particular sector. So connected products is the sort of word that we're covering with the EU Data Act, which is effectively an item that sort of collects data and then transmits it, collects data about its environment and then transmits that on. Again, as I say, sort of sector agnostic, but we do have recital 14, which specifically mentions medical devices as one of the categories that is envisioned to be captured by it. There are others, sort of agricultural and all sorts of other sectors. The other main term caught within the scope of the EU Data Act is the sort of related service. So you've got the connected device, which could obviously be a wearable product, could be implanted, could just be could sit in its environment, And then you've got the related service, which is effectively the software or whatever that the data is being sent to, which is an integral part of the service. Without the related service, the product loses some of its functionality. Data, as Joe mentioned just a minute ago, we're talking about personal data and non-personal data. And the important thing here is that the EU Data Act specifically says this is sort of without prejudice to the GDPR. So if there is personal data involved, you still have all of your GDPR obligations to consider. And then if there's, there are obligations under the EU Data Act which will apply to both personal and non-personal data. So yeah, just a final point, obviously all of the, or many of the products that we had on a couple of slides ago are going to be the ones that are in the scope of this. So what are the key obligations? Provision of pre-contractual information if you are a manufacturer of a, say, medtech device, and you are selling or renting or whatever to a user, you have obligations to provide them with certain information about the types of data that's going to be generated, how they can access it, how they can make a complaint, for example. And I think that that's, again, a parallel to the type of information that you would typically put in a privacy notice in a sort of GDPR context. So users have a right to access the data generated by the connected product or the related service. They have a right to access it for free. They also have a right to have that data transferred to a third party, and I'll come on to in a minute about the terms on which that can be transferred to a third party, but it's a user right to access and have third parties access personal and non-personal data related to their use. And I think that this is an expansion of the GDPR rights for a couple of reasons. One, and we've put it in square brackets there, is that it extends the current right of data portability to non-personal data as well. And then secondly, users can be both individuals and corporate entities, whereas obviously currently the data protection is only talking about personal data, and corporate data is not personal data. So there's a couple of ways that it's expanded there. The third bullet point is that there is a positive obligation on manufacturers of connected products to design them with these rights of access and portability in mind. And again, I think that sort of, again, there's a parallel to be drawn there between the privacy by design obligations under data protection. So again, I think we just keep coming back to, yes, it's an expansion, but all along the same lines of thought as what has come before. And the final sort of key obligation we've put on the slide is that when the data is being made available to third parties at the request of the user, the contractual terms must be fair, reasonable, and non-discriminatory. So they're sort of borrowing principles from sort of patent licensing in order to do that. It is possible to charge a fee for the transfer in certain cases, again, subject to fairness, and there are sorts of exclusions for SMEs. So I just wanted to focus on this slide on the sort of tension between the right of access and the right of sharing under the EU Data Act and IP rights. And this is going to come on to trade secrets as well, which obviously Lisa and Tom mentioned in the context of the AI Act. So the first point is that data in a database can, if there's been sort of provided it qualifies, so a substantial investment has been made into it, can be protected as its own sort of sui generis EU database right. The EU Data Act expressly says that data that is generated by the use of a connected product or a related service is not protected as an EU database right. So that's quite a significant exclusion, an unusual exclusion of an owner's IP rights to that data. And in terms of what data holders, who could be the manufacturer, they're the people receiving the user's data. and they're the ones being asked to share it with a third party. It's what can they do to resist, limit the data that they're being asked to transfer. And really the only, or the main way that the EU Data Act envisages that they can do that is by reference to trade secrets. And so really what you're needing to say is this part of the data, or if I disclose this data, this trade secret will be revealed. In the first instance, what you're really supposed to do is agree technical and organizational measures with the recipient of the data, the third party who you're being asked to share the data with, and say, well, we need these contractual measures in order to preserve our trade secret. That is, as I say, that's what the Data Act, I think that's its preferred solution. And then there is a right to suspend the transfer if the third party doesn't comply with those. And then there's this, in exceptional circumstances, you can refuse to disclose data if it's highly likely to cause serious economic damage from the disclosure of trade secrets. But if you suspend the transfer, or if you are relying upon this serious economic damage exclusion to not have to disclose the data, you need to report that to the relevant sort of supervisory authority. So as I say, I think the way that the Data Act envisages is those really will be minority situations, and in the most cases you would have to disclose, perhaps with technical and organizational measures. And just the final point there is that there are limits on how the third party is supposed to use the data. They're supposed to only use it as they've agreed with the user of the product, but obviously as a third party they could agree quite wide permissions to use the data, so that may not necessarily be that helpful. I just think there's a couple more. Well, one point that's not on the slide, and I think will probably be particularly relevant in the sort of medtech sector, is that, as I say, the EU Data Act is sort of expressly subordinate to the EU GDPR. And so a lot of medtech data is going to be involving personal data, particularly special category data, health data, genetic data, biometric data, for example. And so those may be more viable grounds on which to resist disclosure or limit disclosure, because you say, well, we don't have a lawful basis, for example, or there's a risk to doing so. But I think that probably within the next 5 years, this is going to be an area where there's likely to be, general court, CJEU court cases testing, well, can I rely upon this IP right to resist disclosure? Can I rely upon this principle of GDPR to resist disclosure? So I think that will be how that's going to go. And then this is just really a summary of the Data Act from the perspective of a user. As I say, it's a sort of an expansion of the user's right to have their personal data provided to them. They now also have their non-personal data provided to them, and they have the right to share that with who they wish. The fourth bullet point, I think, just picks up on what I was just saying there, is that probably there's going to be pushback on just disclosing this data that might contain, if not trade secret, then at least sensitive information, confidential information that doesn't quite meet the criteria for a trade secret, as I think that's where there's going to be pushback. And that we're going to do a sort of a wrap-up slide at the end on these are the practical points to take away, but obviously in order to prepare for this, it's going to be a case of having that transparency notice, updating your terms to provide for data sharing, implementing technical and organizational measures to protect your IP in the data that needs to be disclosed. So yeah, I think that's all on that one, and now it's over to Jo.
Thank you. Yeah, so you can see that the trade secrets point is actually going to be increasingly important. because of these Data Act rights. And some of these rights may seem weird, so you will, like in your context, the user could be a corporate user, not just a private user. So like a site could, instead of having a kind of like a paid for service whereby, through a subscription, they're getting a right to see the data generated by the devices that they use, they will actually have a right standalone, statutory. So developers of products have to develop their products in a way which accommodates these Data Act requirements. Now in the UK, again, we've tried to be a bit more flexible. So this is the developments in the UK data protection regime. I won't go into that in too much detail because there are just a few little points, but I wanted to pick out that there is some stuff in here which is in concept talking about things which are parallel to the objectives of the EU Data Act. So the DUA, we're calling it, establishes a potential framework which requires the sharing of customer data and business data. It is not as wide-reaching as the EU Data Act. It is going to require secondary legislation or governance or guidance, and it's going to probably be sector-specific. So what it says is that it empowers the creation of smart data schemes. Now we have things like open banking, for example, already sector-specific. What we might envisage is that in certain sectors, like in this sector, there may be further regulation requiring data sharing. And it's very much a watch this space at the moment. But similar sorts of requirements there in terms of providing access to non-personal data upon request on FRAND types of terms. Really, again, looking at the objectives of trying to empower the users of connected devices, but in a similar approach to the approach that the UK has taken in relation to AI governance and AI regulation. And I think it's interesting, one of the, we had this discussion earlier on, one of the key players, and we've seen in the first talk, where is the money coming from? It's the US. And the US is a great, is a huge influencer here, trying to get the EU to rail back on some of the regulation that it has implemented. And I think the UK is very mindful of that and trying to play this kind of middle position of achieving the EU objectives, but looking super flexible. So that's where we are, I think. Certain other things, we may see some further particular guidance expanding on what special category data means, which could be helpful in this sector for clarity, such as neuro types of data. And there are some additional terms which are intended to facilitate scientific research. So one of the things that has been problematic is the need to get consent, which is specific and informed in relation to the purpose for which you are obtaining that data. And sometimes you don't even know what the purpose is because research evolves. So that is something that this Act is trying to envisage, allowing for compatible purposes with the original purpose and providing a regime for permitting that so long as that some adequate safeguards are in place. So that's something that can be explored if you are carrying out research and you're looking at your governance framework. And then we did want to update you on this anonymization point, which Tom is going to do.
Yeah, I'll just cover this briefly. There's just been a couple of developments this year which is worth commenting on, and I think this picks up on the point about adequate safeguards being data minimization in the last slide, is that pseudonymization or anonymization would be an example of that. Obviously, the basic position under the GDPR is that anonymous data is no longer identifiable and therefore it's no longer personal data and is completely, well, until the Data Acts come along, it was almost free to do what you want with. Pseudonymous data has been partly de-identified, but for example, you may replace names with a number, but you also have separately the key to decoding and re-identifying the individual. So that's pseudonymous data, that's still personal data, and therefore the full suite of data protection obligations still applies to that. The ICO has issued guidance, that was in March this year. We were ahead of the EU decision that I'll come on to next. But this is talking about taking a risk-based approach to, well, how anonymous does the data need to be? And, in most cases, if you tried hard enough with all of the resources in the world, it probably would be possible to re-identify the data. And so previously, I think there was a thought of, well, the EU GDPR is quite a hard line about it. It's either anonymous or it's not. The ICO's guidance was, well, you can take a risk-based approach. Is it reasonably likely that the data will be re-identified, taking into account the cost of doing that? How long will it take to do it? And what is the state of technology that would allow the data to be re-identified? And to do that, you apply a motivated intruder test. If someone was motivated to re-identify it, how far would they get in doing so? So that guidance came out in March this year from the UK, obviously quite helpful in just reassuring businesses that they can take the sort of risk-based approach rather than a pure black and white approach. And then there was a later case. This decision was in September this year under the EU GDPR. Again, this is talking about sharing personal data with a third party, where in the data controller's hands, they had the means of identifying. I think it was some comments from people involved in an insolvency scheme. They had the means of re-identifying or identifying who gave those comments. They gave anonymized comments over to a third party who couldn't re-identify them, and the decision, well, the case turned on whether in the third party's hands was it personal data. And I think that this is an example of the EU sort of moving closer to that risk-based approach and saying, well, pseudonymized data in some circumstances may actually prevent the people other than the controller from identifying that. So it's no longer identified. So pseudonymized data is as good as anonymized data in certain circumstances. Interestingly, the data controller still should have had, even though it was non-personal data, they still needed to put in their privacy notice that they were sharing that non-personal data with the third party. But I think that this again shows a sort of, even under the EU GDPR, you can take more of a risk-based approach to sharing de-identified data. And so I think that's, that's good news. Just very quickly, just one slide on this, cybersecurity. There's some context, obviously, it's on the rise. I think I was amused when I found these statistics because the report says that actually, if you looked purely at the statistics, it looked lower than the previous year. But that's, I think, because, or the report concluded that was because the cyber attacks were more sophisticated and they actually just hadn't been noticed, rather than that the number had gone down. So that's good news. But the cybersecurity and resilience bill is making its way through the sort of parliamentary process. We're still operating under the NIS regulations, which we brought into UK law after Brexit. The EU has since updated them to NIS 2. The purpose of this cybersecurity and resilience bill is to more closely align us again. And it's another one of those ones where it's giving powers to the Secretary of State to designate other sectors. So again, it's a sort of watch this space, because in the future they could designate, say, medtech as a sector that needs to be brought within the NIS sort of scope.
Thanks so much. And we're just going to wrap up with a few. There's a lot of regulation and a lot of stuff coming. So we're just going to wrap up with a few high-level practical considerations to, bring it home if you're actually kind of trying to tackle how to deal with this. So I've put a few over there. One thing very clear from Tom and Lisa's talk is that the AI governance framework needs to be considered. But alongside that, there's going to be risk assessments. You are going to need to bear in mind contract reviews in relation to supply chains. That's very important in relation to data protection, but also in relation to how you're going to comply with Data Act type requirements, as well as cybersecurity resilience. So I think that's a top takeaway to be considering supply chain issues. You've got to consider if products are in scope and build compliance steps from there. So that's what I was talking about at the beginning, assessing data, data capture, data flows, and working out governance and compliance responsibilities from there, and bearing in mind that these are not now limited to GDPR, personal data type stuff, but also things to do with non-personal data collection. I think both our sessions have focused on the importance of trade secret governance, and that is something to look at in terms of AI policies. One final thing, which is a focus of the EU Data Act, but not something that we specifically talked about, but worth mentioning, is that the EU Data Act creates this freedom from lock-in for certain types of connected services, namely kind of cloud services. So it's always been, a risk. Like if you're engaging with appointing cloud service providers, what happens with your data when you terminate? Are there long lock-in periods? And as users contracting with cloud service providers or providers of such services, you're going to need to be looking at data handling and provisions on termination, because this is where the market is moving. And I think we are seeing a lot of requests from clients in terms of training, training in terms of AI literacy, data handling, data governance, and AI issues. So that is very topical. In relation to personal data, it is the usual stuff, very important in this regard. One thing I would pick out is the extent of impact assessments is quite considerable. When we're talking about data protection, impact assessments, that is enhanced. There's a lot of guidance from the ICO in relation to AI and data protection, which has to be built into your impact assessment. If there are international transfers, you've got to do a transfer risk assessment. So there's quite a lot over there. It can be complex, but it is an important part of the accountability principle to do it and record it. And finally, just to wrap up in relation to cybersecurity, this is, we've seen that the cybersecurity bill is making its way through Parliament. We think that the direction of travel is basically that there are going to be much more detailed cybersecurity requirements in a broad range of sectors, and it is just good business, and your insurers will require it, et cetera, et cetera. Think about your internal policies and your supply chain with cybersecurity requirements, data, and AI in mind.